Okay, let's start with the introduction. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. So while we're waiting for more people to filter in, I will give a short introduction. I'm really excited today that we have Dr. Casey Fiesler from University of Colorado Boulder joining us. And as some of you may know, as part of the Year of Science at Barnard College, the Vagelos Computational Science Center is excited about this new Diversity in Computing speaker series, which will run for the academic year and features talks from scholars and practitioners in computational fields who explore what DEI looks like in STEM. So the idea for this series emerges out of an urgent need to more fully consider the ethical and social implications of computing and its applications. For example, in designing addictive social media platforms or in using AI for facial or name recognition, which can lead to housing discrimination, racial biases in job hiring, or restrictions on personal freedoms through public and private surveillance. To better understand how to counter these biases, this series attempts to rethink STEM disciplines with computational components as part of them. We invite one speaker every month to speak about the work that they're doing to diversify and broaden inclusion in their fields by either sharing their research and experiences or their thoughts on how power structures within computing disciplines should be transformed to create more equitable systems. And with that, I'm excited to introduce Casey Fiesler, who is an assistant professor in information science and computer science by courtesy at the University of Colorado Boulder, as well as a fellow in the Silicon Flatirons Institute for Law, Technology, and Entrepreneurship at University of Colorado Law School. She researches and teaches in the areas of technology ethics and internet law and policy and online communities. Her work on research ethics for data science, ethics, education in computing, and broadening participation in computing is supported by the National Science Foundation, and she is the recipient of an NSF Career Award. She's also a public scholar and frequent commentator and speaker on topics of technology, ethics, and policy, and her research has been covered everywhere from the New York Times to Teen Vogue. That's awesome. But she's most proud of her TikToks, which I hope she can talk about today a little bit. She holds a PhD in human-centered computing from Georgia Tech and a JD from Vanderbilt Law School. So, Dr. Fiesler, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And here we are. So, I've been working on issues adjacent to technology, ethics, and policy for a number of years. And in these very interesting ways, a lot of seemingly disconnected projects tend to start to converge in ways that I see broader lessons from them. I randomly picked three, but this is going to take you a bit on a tour through a bit of my research, but really this is more sort of a big ideas talk as opposed to a research talk. So first of all, I sometimes joke that working in technology ethics means that I just make slides that look like this over and over until I retire. And this particular slide is a little bit of where some of this started for me. So when I first started my faculty position in 2015, there was a sort of renaissance of thinking about research ethics in computer science, especially data science, and especially concerning like the origins of data. Where are we getting all of this data that we're using to train artificial intelligence, for example? Like, it doesn't come from nowhere, it's coming from somewhere. It's coming from, for example, dating sites or YouTube. And I was thinking about this a lot at the time because I had a lot of conversations with people about these practices. And I was really starting to think about, like, how does our practices as technologists, whether we're people who are building technology or studying technology, what is the impact that this is actually having on people? And as I talked to researchers who were using data from lots of sources like these, I started hearing a lot about IRBs, institutional review boards. In the United States, this is what governs research ethics at universities. And so actually just the other day, someone else made a TikTok about the Stanford-based sexual orientation prediction AI. And a bunch of people in the comments were like, how is this ethical? How are they able to do this? Like, how are they able to get people's photos from dating sites without their consent? And some people even said, well, what did their IRB say about this? I don't understand how this could be okay. And the answer to this is that IRBs as a regulatory body don't typically consider collection of public data online to be human subjects research because it doesn't fall under this very legal definition. As we know, law and ethics are not the same thing. That is the number one thing that I tried to teach on the very first day of my class. But that doesn't mean that there's not potential harm from research that uses this kind of data. But we very often hear as a result of people getting upset about, for example, data collection of, I don't know, all of OkCupid, including, very sensitive personal information about people, well, the data is public. And so, again, I'm interested in part in the impact that this is having on people. Like, how can we make ethical decisions if we don't know anything beyond a very simple guideline like, well, the data is public. And so a few years ago, myself and a collaborator decided to ask a fairly simple research question, which was, how do Twitter users feel about the use of their tweets in research? And we picked Twitter because Twitter is, as Zeynep Tufekci once said, the fruit fly of social media research. We don't study it because it's the best thing to study. We study because it's the easiest thing to study. And wow, are there a lot of papers using Twitter data. So I'm gonna just tell you our findings very quickly. This was a survey-based study. So first of all, even in the sample of people we had who were participating in research, so like, kind of know what research is, most of them had no idea that this is a thing that happens. And anecdotally, that's what I hear from most people when I talk about it. Why on earth would scientists want to be reading my tweets? That's weird. And almost half of them thought, well, this can't possibly be allowed. And a lot of people brought up, things like informed consent, et cetera. Now, the purpose of this research was not to figure out, like, should we or should we not, use tweets? Is it ethical or unethical to use? There's no way to answer that question. It's not a binary question. It's, if we're going to have certain practices, what are the best ways that we can do it? And so we needed to actually understand, like, the nuances of how people actually felt. And so I'm going to show you this chart that you're not going to be able to read in the few seconds that I have it up here, and that's okay. I'm just going to tell you the big picture here, which is that a lot of different things matter. Like how comfortable people are with their tweets being used in research. Things matter, like, what the tweet is and who's researching it and what they're doing with it and how they're analyzing it and all of these kinds of things that are beyond just, is it public or not? The problem with publicness being the only thing that matters for this particular one example of an ethical question is that it suggests, for example, that a tweet about what someone had for breakfast is equivalent to a tweet revealing someone's HIV status, for example. That it doesn't matter what the context is or what the possible harm is or who the person who tweeted it was. None of that matters. All that matters is that it's public. And this is an insufficient ethical guideline. And so with one of my PhD advisees, Brianna Dim, we were digging into this a little bit more and looking at particular types of vulnerable communities. And in this particular interview study she did was mostly talking to LGBTQ people about how they felt about, for example, their Tumblr posts being quoted in research articles or in news articles. People told us stories about fan art showing up on BuzzFeed, for example. And the kinds of harms they talked about had to do with revealing this to a much broader audience, having the potential to out people, for example. And something else that we heard about was also this idea that researchers would just like parachute into a community that they don't understand and just like take stuff out of it and make assumptions based on not talking to anyone in the community. And they talked about ways that this could potentially do harm. And actually with one of my other PhD advisees, Shamika Klassen, she interviewed people who are part of Black Twitter. And we heard the same thing. Like, really, are these researchers, probably mostly white researchers, just taking stuff out of our community, making assumptions, analyzing it without talking to us, and not giving anything back? And seeing that as a particular problem as well. And one of the underlying problems here is that often people don't see data, like data is just data, right? These aren't humans, these are tweets. It's just data. And so something that I've really been trying to get out with my research and talking about this is this idea, here's my first lesson, is that data is people. It's not just data. If it comes from people, and it's not just that it comes from people, it's also that it's impacting people, that the way that you use that data in whatever way you're going to use it, it's going to have some impact on people. And so if we go back to this example, it's not just the idea of like, where are you getting it from and how might this be harmful? But imagine, for example, that you've created YouTube videos about your gender transition and then find out that someone has used those videos that you made to help your community to train facial recognition that could, even if this is not the intention, a malicious intention, but it could be used to identify trans people in ways that could be dangerous. And I mentioned earlier this example because it came up on TikTok again. And a lot of people were upset about the potential ethics of this project. And one of the things that people, talked about again were this idea of unintended consequences. Like, well, even though they didn't build the technology in this, could giving someone the idea that they could build this technology that could determine someone's sexual orientation from a photograph, could that give someone an idea? And could there be long-term downstream consequences? And when it comes to long-term downstream consequences, something that we hear, I'm sure, when you think of ethical scandals, a lot of people immediately go to Cambridge Analytica, which is very complicated. It's not just a privacy scandal, it's also a research ethics scandal, it's also an AI scandal. And this was an interesting example because upstream from this, there was research that before the people who created Cambridge Analytica decided to use this idea, there was a research project in which they pointed out this could be bad. There could be considerable negative implications to this fact that we can tell very private attributes about people from their Facebook likes. So now I'm teeing up a conversation about considerable negative implications. So this is the thing that happens a lot, right? It's like, how shouldn't we have known? Should we have known this would happen when we knew this from this paper? Should we have known that the next step would be, to create personality models such that we can, influence political advertising and potentially influence the election, the outcomes of elections? Or here's another example, one of my favorites, not a good thing, one of my favorite examples, Zoom bombing. We had a really bad case of Zoom bombing in my department. People came into a classroom, yelled racial slurs, yelled sexual things to a room full of unsuspecting undergrads. I made a YouTube video about Zoom bombing, and in the process of researching that video, I discovered that there's a bunch of people on YouTube who decided to Zoom bomb and then create YouTube videos of like people's reactions to it, which was truly horrible. But here's why I think that Zoom bombing is an interesting example, because after it happened, the CEO of Zoom gave an interview to the New York Times where he said, we never thought about that. Like it didn't occur to us that someone might misuse our technology, that there might be risks of this particular technology. And hindsight is 2020, etc. However, I do feel like if you had described to me how Zoom works, especially, before they've made some privacy related improvements since then, changed some defaults, etc. But like, our Zoom rooms are, they're public. It's an 8-digit number. I feel like I might have come up with, people are going to like randomly input 8-digit numbers and show up in people's Zoom meetings and then, insert terrible thing. Because we know what humans are like, some humans anyway, right? So there's this concept in computer science that some of you are familiar with, perhaps, called technical debt. It's this idea that like, there's going to be bugs, because nothing's perfect, but you've got a release date. Like, you need to get this thing out. So, there's probably going to be bugs, but you can fix them later. So technical debt is the debt that you accrue by choosing, something easy or fast now, instead of something that would take longer. But the idea is that you can fix the bugs once you know what they are, right? Technical debt. So one of the things that we've been thinking about in my research lab, in my PhD advising Natalie Garrett has been thinking a lot about this, is this idea of ethical debt. It's the same kind of thing, except the bug isn't like, oh no, the submit button on the form doesn't work. It's like, oh no, our social media platform accidentally undermined democracy, right? It's if you don't consider the social and ethical implications now, if you think you can just fix them later, then you have another kind of implied cost. And the problem is that this is in this case, the harm is already done, right? Like the students who were Zoom bombed cannot unsee that. And you might say like, well, yeah, but how are we supposed to know? Like, I don't know what my social media platform is going to do to democracy. But we can at least be thinking about it, right? So if you think about some of like, the big ethical scandals that we've had. Oh, also, if you would like to read more about this, Natalie and I wrote an op-ed about ethical debt. So here's an example of, one of the big ethical sort of controversies, things that came out in the past couple of years. This idea that someone might be wrongfully arrested because of a misidentification by facial recognition. This is a big deal, all over the news. Everyone's talking about it. Even like the people, commenting on my TikToks have heard about this particular thing. We should have known this was coming. People did know this was coming. I mean, we've been seeing research about bias in facial recognition since the early 2000s. And then of course, Joy Buolamwini's work, I mean, really, like we knew this should not have been a huge surprise that if facial recognition is being used in this context, that there will be misidentifications and that they will disproportionately impact people of color. And by the way, if you are interested in this topic, I highly recommend the documentary Coded Bias. And even people just watching this documentary and knowing more about this problem, I think is going to be really helpful, which is something that I'll talk about also a little bit later. So, there's this buzzword recently in sort of the tech world, unintended consequences. We're talking about this a lot. How do we prevent unintended consequences? And when I talk about this, a response that I sometimes get is like, well, how am I supposed to see the future? Like, how do you expect me to know all of the ways that my technology or my research might be misused? How am I supposed to know that my video conferencing platform is going to be used by these horrible people and how they're going to use it? Like, I am not clairvoyant. I cannot see the future. These consequences are unintended, so it's not my fault. So I would like to challenge that a little bit. I don't think that people should be able to see the future. But I think that there are some things that we should be able to anticipate. For example, the example that I just gave, bias in facial recognition. We've known, right? On the other hand, perhaps this is a skill that technologists haven't particularly cultivated. But you know who's particularly good at this kind of thing? Science fiction writers. So this is a quote from Isaac Asimov, that science fiction writers foresee the inevitable. And though problems and catastrophes may be inevitable, solutions are not. But you know who's really good at thinking about solutions sometimes? Technologists, people who are often tasked with finding solutions. So part of what I've been thinking about lately is like, how do we help technologists think more like science fiction writers, or at least this is something that we should be thinking about, right? So science fiction, I'm sure, as I talk about this, I'm sure you're all thinking of like your favorite robot war or episode of Black Mirror. And I'm going to mention Black Mirror in particular because so if you're not familiar with Black Mirror, it is a science fiction anthology series, sort of like Twilight Zone, where every episode is standalone. And it is intentionally, it is interrogating sort of our current relationships with technology, is sort of the point of the show. There are, out of a number of seasons, a couple of episodes that are sort of positive about technology, but the vast majority of them are like, let's take a current anxiety about technology, push it forward a couple of decades or so, and think about all the things that could go wrong. And we often see like, those current anxieties in the show. So, an episode airs like this one, Playtest, which was about augmented reality, and immediately all these headlines pop up about like our current technology that's almost there. And the episodes themselves, you can often tell, are like inspired by current conversations and anxieties, right? So, this combination of like social scoring systems and social media performance anxiety. If you think about those two things together, there was an episode called Nosedive, which was like, what if the entire world was like based on a social credit system that kind of looked like Instagram, but you are like constantly rating everyone that you meet in real life, and then your rating impacts like whether you can get an apartment and whether you can get on a plane. And of course, it goes very badly for our protagonist. One of my favorite examples, in part because one of my colleagues studies what happens to your data after you die. And he's actually the one who told me about this headline over on the left here from the startup a number of years ago that's like, when your heart stops beating, you'll keep tweeting. This like current technology, like we can absolutely create chat bots of people who are no longer with us based on digital communication patterns. And in fact, like Microsoft has a new patent about this from like a year or two ago. And there was this episode of Black Mirror, what happens if you could bring back someone via first a chat bot and then a phone call, and then of course, because this is science fiction, a completely realistic robot, and what could possibly go wrong. The thing that I think is interesting here, and we're thinking about like, how can technologists think more like science fiction writers? So this quote, that someone's job is to think up some difference in the world, make sure that the human reactions to it, the changes that society builds around it, that it feels right. I have to think through the unintended and unexpected consequences of second and third and fourth order ripples. So this is a quote from Michael Older, who's a science fiction writer I will recommend her book, Infomocracy. But this ability to think through the ripples, like what's going to happen next, how do we do that? So I've been thinking about this in teaching, like just as an exercise to get people thinking like this, right? So I've been using this teaching exercise that I call the Black Mirror Writers Room. This link takes you to a slide deck if you want to try it for yourself, if you're a teacher. And basically, I have this process to sort of walk students through thinking about a current issue in technology, something that an ethical issue or a technology. Think about where it's going to be in like 10 years. What could go wrong? And then think about whose story that is, because it's fun to tell stories. And I think it really helps you like dig into something. And then I have this like template where, creating artifacts is also fun for this kind of thing. So for example, a group of students in my class last year came up with this Black Mirror episode they titled Revisionist History, where the idea was that there was a textbook app that became personalized to your interests. So they were taking the idea of like current anxieties over like social media personalization and how the news that you're getting might be different than the news the person next to you is getting, and how that influences your outlook on the world. Well, what if your history books were like that? And so in their story, someone realizes that they're getting a completely different view of history than the person sitting next to them, which ends up being a problem for AP US history exams. But then we talk about, how do we not get to this future? Like, it can be fun to think about how things might go wrong, but also what could change such that things might not happen this way? Is it technology design? Is it regulation? Is it social norms? Is it something else? And so I think, one of the things that I've been thinking about is, if I can get students excited about thinking through the ethical implications of some technology that someone might create in 50 years, why can't you do exactly the same thing with the technology that you might create tomorrow? So one of the things that I'm doing next is taking this kind of speculative exercise and taking it into, for example, software design classes, user-centered design classes, project capstones. You're building a technology, startup competitions. How can you think through the ethical implications in the same way? So this would be my second lesson. We need to start thinking about ethics early in the technology design process. This is not for the end. It's not an add-on. It's not like it's not a PR like thing. Oh, fine. I guess I have to think about ethics now. And I have a whole other talk that I could give. And if I had 4 lessons instead of 3 lessons, I would be telling you in more detail about this now. But I actually think that this idea here, early, is an important part of like computing education as well. We should be talking about ethics and ethical implications in your intro programming class and every class after that, instead of saving it until your required computer science ethics class that you take as a senior, if at all. So this is something that I've been really excited about, is thinking about how can we scaffold this process of speculation early in the design process so that we can fix problems before they happen and don't accrue ethical debt. So, going back to Zoom as an example, one of the things that I thought about in particular for Zoom was, should we have known this? And something that you hear a lot about when it comes to like this kind of thing, like being able to think through ethical implications, et cetera, is like, well, maybe computing students, the people who are going to build these technologies or, create startups or whatever, they need more humanities training. And I agree with this. I would like to see this. Maybe some science fiction classes would be good here as well. And I do think that this is great. I think that, I would also like to see ethics classes, for computing students that are taught by like very deep subject matter experts, in addition to like in-situ learning, just-in-time learning. Like when you're taking a machine learning class, you are learning machine learning ethics. You're not reading Kant, you're learning machine learning ethics in your machine learning class, and then you take another class where maybe you learn about Kant. But there's the other side of this as well, which is like this idea that like, well, okay, so, but also do all of the humanities students need to be learning how to code? And I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Like, do I think that everyone should learn how to code? I don't think it would hurt. I sort of feel like, my computer science education, when I took my first intro programming class in 2001, it was taught in Scheme. I feel like that changed the way that I saw the world, and I have a sort of understanding, even though I don't tend to code a lot these days because my job doesn't require it. I don't build things, I study things, but I know how things are built, and I think that means something. But I was thinking about like, what do I actually think that people need to know? So I give talks in a lot of class, like guest lectures and in classes, please come talk to my technical computer science class about ethics. And then I make one of these slides, which I said, I just make slides like this over and over and over. I made this one in about 5 minutes because I was giving a guest lecture in an undergrad algorithms class. I went to Google News and I typed in algorithm, and all of these stories were from the last 3 weeks from whenever I did this. I mean, just like story after story, everything about algorithms was all like about bias and ethical implications and misuses and this kind of thing. And I was thinking at the time, like, the students who are taking this class, but I mean, really, like, any computing student who, learns like basic code and how computers work are going to understand what's going on with these controversies a lot more than sort of the average person. And I was thinking about this again recently with, the Facebook files, and I could have changed my whole talk just to talk about Facebook after the past couple of weeks. But as I was thinking about these stories, so this was one example, where they talked about how certain like optimization for certain engagement metrics, privileged content, that might make people angry because content that gets an emotional reaction is likely to get certain types of engagement, which yet ... And one of the things I was thinking was like, over the past 5 years or so, I think this is finally becoming more clear, but like 5 years ago, people didn't even know that Facebook had an algorithm. Like a lot of people didn't realize that there was any curation of their feed at all, let alone that features like this might be involved in an algorithm. And so it's not that I need you to be able to code this. I don't need you to know how to build Facebook. I don't even need you to necessarily like know, what students would know in that algorithms class, but having a basic understanding of what an algorithm is, how it works, allows you to critique it, which I think is really important. And actually, if we go back to this example, one of the things actually that is in the Coded Bias documentary is an example of a woman who realized that like the way that she was being treated by a recidivism algorithm was probably unfair. But you have to know that algorithm exists, that how an algorithm can be racist, why, and that it might be working on you. So like having an understanding of how technology might be working on you, I think is incredibly important and implies a basic kind of like algorithmic computational literacy. And this actually is one of the reasons why, as has come up a couple of times, I've started making TikToks. And I've actually been a little surprised by a few things. I actually originally started making TikToks because I was giving advice to graduate students. So last summer, summer of 2020, missing talking to people, I started a YouTube channel giving advice to graduate students and mostly PhD applicants. And then I noticed that about what was it, like 75% of my audience, according to YouTube's metrics and however they decide to measure this, was male. And so I went and asked on Twitter, I was like, hey, if I wanted to like give women advice for applying to PhD programs, like where could I go? And someone said, you should make TikToks, which actually made absolutely no sense to me at the time, because like YouTube is a search engine, and how could TikTok possibly like find people who are applying to PhD programs and put my videos in front of them? And I was like, well, I'll just try it. So like one day I like downloaded TikTok, scrolled through it a little bit, found some trending music, and made like 2 videos that was like me pointing at things while giving advice about statements of purpose. And the next day I woke up and had like 50,000 views on one of those videos, and like comments from people being like, thank you, this is so helpful, I'm applying to PhD programs. And I, as someone, I know that technology is not magic, but I was darn impressed by that particular algorithm. I wasn't expecting it to be a great place for science communication, but I made one video about racism and technology and it blew up. And then I realized also that a lot of people don't know about this stuff. I take it for granted, being who I am and surrounded by the people that I am and reading the things that I do, et cetera. The idea that like artificial intelligence can be biased, that an algorithm can be racist, like this is just, it obviously, right? But it's not obvious. And how are you supposed to learn these things, right? So I started making TikToks about this. And then of course, in the course of this, I started thinking a lot about the ethical implications of algorithms like the one that TikTok has. And so then I started talking about that. And it's this interesting sort of, feedback cycle. But I think that people are learning things. And again, I'm not teaching them to code. I'm teaching them enough about how machine learning works that you can understand how machine learning might be biased, when it might be biased, and when it might be affecting you. And I think this kind of thing, because again, this whole like everyone should learn to code thing is also often a like diversity initiative, which I think is so important. There is, these headlines don't even hit the tip of the iceberg, right? Like this is a problem. Even like, as someone who does tech ethics, the number of times that people tell me I should watch the Social Dilemma documentary on Netflix, like almost every single one of my TikToks, someone comments and tells everyone they should watch the Social Dilemma, which is like fine. I think, the Social Dilemma is an excellent documentary for, introducing people to some of these very basic concepts, exactly the kind of thing I was talking about. So I actually really hope that a lot of people watch it. But it is a little bit striking how that documentary is like a parade of white men. And the reason for that, it's the reason it's a little ironic is because like, it's basically about tech ethics, right? Like that's kind of at the core of this documentary. And this is an area that was pioneered by women, especially women of color. And it's like 20 minutes into that documentary before a woman says anything other than her name. But the reason for this is because the narrative that they took for the documentary was like a lot of people in tech sort of talking about like how they got it wrong. And so, if people have been around in tech long enough to get it wrong, then they're probably a white man. So yes, diversity becomes important, but it's in part because it helps us see potential problems, because humans are not as good at empathy as perhaps we would like them to be. And it's very easy to imagine the harms of the world in the way that they might harm you. So if we go back to Zoom bombing, for example, and, you know, I said before, like, hindsight is 2020, but I feel like if you had described Zoom to me, I could have told you these horrible things that people are going to do. Because you know who's really good at imagining ways that technology might be used to harass people? People who get harassed a lot. Women, people of color, queer people, etc. And look, I'm just naming off all the people who are underrepresented in tech. There's this book, Design Justice by Sasha Choke, that is a great book. You should read it. And also at some point it quotes this tweet. If your beta social network doesn't allow blocking abusers from the jump, your beta social network was probably developed by white dudes. Because if you're someone who gets harassed a lot online, you're gonna immediately think of all the ways that this could go wrong. And technological harms disproportionately impact people from marginalized groups. On the other hand, it should not be on the shoulders of those people to fix all of our problems, right? This is very complicated. But, you know, one of the things that I thought about as well when I was thinking about this kind of problem, so, you know, also on the topic of design, like, who wrote, you know, sort of the Bible on design, user-centered design? Don Norman. You know, I read this when I was getting my master's degree in HCI, the design of everyday things. A few years ago, he wrote this op-ed about what he was seeing today about design that horrified him, and it was that the world was not designed for the elderly, because now he is elderly. And now he could see that. And I really think, you know, that there are things that we might do, like all of this thing, everything I'm talking about speculating about the future is really important. But we also have to make sure that everyone isn't just speculating about the harms to themselves, right? And so I think that's really important to keep in mind as well. The other thing about empowering people to critique technology is that you might also empower them to create it. So, you know, there are some wonderful examples of like communities building technologies for themselves that I think we can learn a lot from. And again, this is something else that I could give an entire talk about, but I'm going to give you the 2-minute version. One of my very favorite examples of this ever is Archive of Our Own, which is a fan fiction platform that was built by and for, you know, it was built by the community that it serves. If you know anything about fan fiction, the demographics are predominantly women. And actually, here are some demographics from, this is actually from a while ago, but I've done some large scale surveys and fandoms and can tell since then and can tell you that this does not change. Mostly women, more actually like genderqueer people than cis men, and a very large percentage of LGBTQ people in this particular community. And so in building a platform, the things that they did in the design of this platform to incorporate, you know, inclusivity and accessibility and privacy and all of these kinds of things that are often afterthoughts on other systems, I think are really interesting. And my PhD advisee, Brianna, right now is actually studying a social platform that is built by, you know, a segment of this community as well, in which they're building in kind of from the start these, you know, types of privacy, ways to control your privacy and control who can see your content, while also respecting other kinds of things around the types of content that people want to post there, etc. And my other PhD advisee, Shamika, has been studying Black Twitter as an example of a community using appropriating a platform to build community when that platform was not built by or for them. And the challenges that brings, but also what might the future look like if it was built by and for the Black community. And so I don't, again, I don't think that everyone needs to be a tech CEO. However, I think that if we empower people to understand both the flaws and the potential in technology, that we're going to get something really special. We're going to get more examples of things like archive of our own. Also, I just realized that I have labeled this with number 2 instead of number 3, but you are fortunate because I have an overview slide. I have indeed given you 3 lessons as part of this talk. So this idea that we need to understand the humans in data and the way that data and research will impact humans, that ethics needs to be an early part of any technology design or research in order to avoid ethical debt, and that part of that involves speculation, and that we need to think about ways to empower critique of technology. And I will actually leave on this final note. I spend a lot of time thinking about the evils of technology, but I also think it's amazing. I think the internet is a wonderful, wonderful thing that has done amazing things for people. And I love it so much that I want it to be better. I love technology. I love social media. I love the internet. And I critique it because I love it. And in fact, this is why I named my research group the Internet Rules Lab, because we study rules on the internet and the way that the internet rules. And I will leave you with this, with an image of some of the amazing students that I mentioned, and I would love to take some questions.
Thank you so much. That was great. I was just nodding my head the whole time. So thank you so much for sharing that with us and boiling it down to those 3 really powerful lessons. We've been asking people to think about questions and share their thoughts with us. So anyone who's watching, feel free to unmute yourself or turn your video on. We have a raised hand. So Anissa, if you want to, feel free to ask away.
Hi. I just wanted to say thank you so much. That was so engaging and covered so much of what I'm interested in. But what you were saying about ethical debt and how that should really be something that we start the ideation process with looking at. Do you know what the protocol for that is now when new innovations are coming out or when public platforms are coming out with regulations on data? Is there any backstop or what's the process for that?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, something like how does the technology design process work, and are people thinking about potential harms early on? I think is going to be different for every company, every team, every product. I mean, you also mentioned regulation, and I'll say, regulation often tends to be quite reactionary. You know how you sometimes see safety signs and you worry about what happened to cause that sign, right? You walk by a wood chipper and there's a giant sign that says don't stick your head in the wood chipper, and you're oh no, someone must have stuck there. Yeah. So sometimes regulation of technology is like that. Something bad happens and then we need regulation, and there's reasons for that, and I don't think, for example, that we should be creating regulations right now to prepare us for the robot wars. That would not be a good use of our time. But it is a challenge, right? Because often regulation does not come until after the harm has already been done, whereas the people who are building the technology have the power to do something before the harm happens. That said, to be fair, we don't see this, right? Because we only see the harm a lot of times. I've been talking about this with respect to content moderation recently, that content moderation is something that you only see when it's bad, because either you see oh, there's a bunch of hate speech, clearly their content moderation isn't working, or you're seeing oh no, they're taking down all the stuff that they shouldn't be. Clearly their content moderation isn't working, but you don't see when it takes down stuff that it should take down because it's gone. So, you know, we never know like how much worse could Facebook be, you know, if things hadn't been done. And you know, this is just a challenge. But, you know, in terms of like, how should we do this? One of the research projects that I'm working on right now is like, what kinds of tools could I give people to help them do this kind of speculation, like during the design process of technology? So I don't know, stay tuned for that.
Thank you, Anissa, for your question. Is there anyone else who'd like to jump in and ask a question? We have a comment saying people are a huge fan of your TikTok, and thank you so much for your work. And so while people are thinking, I will go ahead and ask a question. So my question comes from both ends. One is from the perspective of industry, and one is from the perspective of education, where you sit. Regardless of whether there is regulation or not, there is always the fact that these, at the end of the day, these are corporations, and corporations are meant to make money. And so how do you balance ethical decisions with the motivation to make money if you are someone within industry that is powered by that ideology? And then on the other hand, how do you feel education plays into this? Because it's very clear that you feel passionate about engagement, and you obviously feel like the internet gives us something that is actually wonderful. And so you are critiquing it because you want to make it better. So I'm just curious about how you feel about both industry and education, and with respect to technology ethics.
So I mean, you know, your first question, like it's like, you know, like that's the big question, right? I mean, sometimes people ask me like, what is it, the root cause of, you know, a lot of these like ethical is it just that we've got all these like unethical people? Is it like, are we not teaching computer science ethics? And I'm like, hashtag capitalism. Like, it's just like it you know, if we want to take Facebook as an example, or, you know, any sort of social platform, this is what comes up a lot. Like, you know, people aren't creating social platforms out of the kindness of their hearts, usually. Archive of Our Own being a very good counter example. But even something like Archive of Our Own, or like Wikipedia, is another example of like things that don't have to make money. It's because they get donations, because you still have to pay for the servers. Oh, can you all still see me? Everyone froze.
Yes, we see.
Okay, good. Okay, good. So, you know, you have to make money. I mean, I would often hold up like Mozilla as an example of like what I saw as kind of like, you know, like one of the, you know, tech companies. It's like, but even they like did this huge restructuring a couple of years ago, and then wrote this blog post about like, and they fired all my friends, and then they wrote this blog post about like, you know, the restructuring. And one of the bullet points was basically, we need to figure out how to make money. And, you know, it's true. Like it would be great if somehow there was a way that didn't matter, but it does. And if you're going to make money, you know, like advertising is obviously like, you know, the big model for, you know, like the most common model for social platforms, for example. And if advertising is your business model, then the important thing is eyeballs on ads. And the way to get eyeballs on ads is to keep people on the platform. I mean, it's the same way that like the way that, you know, Zynga or whoever made money for Candy Crush was like basically by designing it like a slot machine. And you know, so if you're gonna make, you know, the like business argument for ethics, I mean, I don't really, this is one of those things that I would love to like figure out what the actual answer to this is, but two things come to mind for me just based on my sort of intuition. And one is bad PR. I mean, and it's no small thing. Like there's been some research that showed, for example, or this might be more anecdotal, but that like a lot of people will use Lyft instead of Uber because they perceive it as a more ethical company. So there is a business argument for ethics in that way. Also losing talent. And this is where I actually think that the education component comes in as well. There was, there were some news stories a couple of years ago about how like, computer science students didn't want to work for Facebook because they perceived them as being an unethical company. I mean, I personally like part of my personal opinion about this is that I would rather see some ethical people working at Facebook than only unethical people working at Facebook personally. But I think that this could be a real motivator. Actually, I'm working with an undergraduate computer science student right now who's doing her senior thesis, and she's talking to graduating computer science students about like what kinds of things matter to them when they decide whether to take a job at a tech company. And part of our sort of underlying question there is how much the ethics of a company matter. Like, what are the kinds of things that matter? And one of the things that I would like to come out of this actually is like a set of questions that students could ask at job interviews. And I also think, actually, I've been meaning to like write about this for a while. Like, I think that like technical interviews have the potential to be very important, or like job interviews in tech companies in general, because one, if all of the like really amazing job applicants start asking a bunch of pointed questions about the values of the company, like that could potentially have an impact, right? Also, if tech companies started asking questions about ethics in technical interviews, I guarantee you that all the big computer science departments would start teaching it. Like, sometimes instructors will say to me like, well, I talk about ethics in my class, but it's not like, you can't auto grade ethics. So like, it's not on the test. And students think that if it's not on the test, it's not important. Well, being asked about an ethical decision at a technical job interview is like the ultimate version of being on a test. And, name like top computer science department in the US, does not want their students to look bad because they can't answer questions about ethics. So I have no idea how to make this happen, but that would be on my wish list.